So just as a reminder, what we did yesterday was we went over the 4 ways that characters shape the plot. They shape them through their actions, their thoughts, what they say, and what they feel. Today we are doing everything about plot. Your notes are the pieces in red. That's what you're going to record for your notes. Just as a reminder, a plot is a series of events in a story. Each one is a consequence or reaction of an event that came before it. The plot is driven by a conflict, which is a struggle between opposing forces. So just as we were looking at that character response chart, we were learning that the decisions that the characters made impacted the way that the story went, or the progression of the plot. If you think about if you've ever read a choose your own adventure story, basically the character gets to a situation and then they have to decide what to do. And based on if you choose A or you choose B, the plot goes in a different direction. And that's really what we need to understand about all stories, is that every decision that a character makes and every reaction a character has is the determining factor for the direction that the plot moves in. So plot has these main parts. The first part is the exposition or the introduction. Then we have the conflict, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. The exposition is the introduction. It's the first part of the story. So at the very beginning of a story, if you're reading a short story, this is usually within the first few paragraphs. If you're reading a novel, it's within the first few chapters for sure. We get a good understanding of who the characters are. We know the main character is going to be who the story is centered around, and then minor characters might be mentioned in the story, but they're not the central focus. We're also going to find out the setting, which is where and when the story takes place, and we'll have a good idea about the mood of the story, so how the story makes us feel as we're reading it. And we're definitely going to know who the narrator is, so who is the one telling the story, and we call that the point of view. The initiating event, or the conflict in the story, is what launches the action. It's what really gets the story moving. It makes the problem clear to the reader. Now we need to be careful about using that word problem, because problem has a very negative connotation, and we don't want to imply that just because that the conflict is always negative. Sometimes it could just be that the character wants an action to occur. So for example, if I'm writing a story about a little girl who wants a puppy, that could be the action that she wants to occur, and that would be the conflict in the story. There are different types of conflict, but conflict is always going to be the dramatic struggle between two forces in the story. If we don't have conflict, we don't have plot. And we need a conflict in order to get the story going. There are different types of conflict. We have human versus human. You can see over there where these two guys are fighting. Human versus nature. So for example, bad weather. You might have a family that wants to stay safe with the tornado coming or preparing for bad weather. You can have human versus society, where someone or a group of people is standing up for rights or something that they believe in or passionate about. And then you can have human versus self. This is where a person is struggling to make a decision. So the first 3 mentioned are what we call external conflicts, because they are outside of the character. And then the last one is an internal conflict. It is a character struggling to make a decision. So that's happening inside of them. The next part of the plot is what we call the rising action. This is the development of the problem. So you have to think, how does each event make the conflict worse? This is the part of the story that is really a sequence of causes and effects. And this is what's pushing the story along or moving the story along. Again, thinking back to that character response chart that we did, we know that every event had an effect. And that effect is what moved the story along. The climax is the most exciting part in the story. When you look at a plot diagram, this is the tip top, right, of either like the hill or the roller coaster or however you see it. And this is where the actions reach a crisis, or the moment of greatest conflict and tension. It is also considered to be the turning point in the action, so it's where things start to shift. If your character is going to have a character change, this is often the part of the story where that happens. And as you can see by looking at a plot diagram, this is the transition or the bridge between the rising action and then going into the falling action and conclusion of the story. The falling action is where that conflict is being fixed. And then the resolution is the end of the story. This is usually where they're wrapping up all the story details. You're going to have a good idea of how the problem is solved. So when there's a problem in the story, this is going to be where we are provided with the solution. If it's an action that a character wants, there's going to be some type of resolution. So either the character is going to get what they want or they're not going to get what they want. Sometimes at the end of a story, this is where the author will include some type of reflection that the main character is having, where they're looking back and kind of reminiscing on the events in the story or thinking about how they've grown or changed. It's kind of the lesson learned in the story. Here you see an example of a plot diagram with the parts identified, and the thing to remember here is that plot is the literary element that describes the structure of a story. So when we are talking about literary text, meaning anything that tells a story, a narrative text, it could be narrative nonfiction like a biography, it could be science fiction, but it is showing the arrangement of events and actions within the story. Remember that everything is arranged around a conflict. So anytime you read a literary text, it's going to have this structure or this pattern of organization. Now, flashbacks occur when the writer decides to insert details from the past into a present narrative. And the reason that they do that is to provide necessary plot information. So it's information that you need to understand why things are happening the way they are happening. Or it could be to let you know kind of the character's backstory and why they're motivated to act the way that they are acting. We also see flash forwards and foreshadowing in some stories. Now, a flash forward is when some event that has yet to happen in the present narrative, meaning in the story that they're telling, kind of time intrudes. It bumps in and it's saying kind of what's going to happen in the future. But it's an exact telling. So sometimes when you're reading chapter books, they'll do this and they'll kind of flip between the story they're telling and then they're kind of flashing forward to what the future actually is. Lots of kids have mentioned that when you read the I Survived series, that they do this. They often start with that, where they're kind of telling what's in the future, and then they go back and they start telling the story. Now, they're kind of like foreshadowing, but foreshadowing is different because it's only giving an idea or a hint of what's going to happen in the future. It's not telling the actual future. Sometimes a flash forward is nothing more, like I said, than an opening line that's going to tell a major event that happens in the future, like in a week's time, the Thomas family will be dead. And then it'll leave a big space and then go into the story and start the story. So you already know how it's going to end up, but it's going to back up and tell you the story of how they got there. In Thank You, Ma'am, we can look back at paragraph 17, and I want you to see how the dialogue in paragraph 17 is an example of foreshadowing. It hints at the events at the end of the story. Listen while I read paragraph 17. The woman said, "You ought to be my son. I would teach you right from wrong. Least I can do now is wash your face. Are you hungry?" So this piece of dialogue is full of foreshadowing. Number one, she says, "I would teach you right from wrong." And as you read the story, you realize that was the whole purpose of her taking him back to her house and her talking about her past and giving him the money. She was trying to teach him life lessons, teaching him right from wrong, trying to make him a better person. It also says, "Least I can do right now is wash your face. Are you hungry?" And we know she ends up having him wash his face, she has him brush his hair, and she feeds him. This is just a summary of what we talked about with plot. It reviews each portion of plot.